So welcome back to the Director's Chair, our live stream discussion forum on the intersection of leadership and creativity, two crafts and disciplines that are vitally important to one another. Last week, we explored how we as leaders can sharpen our creative edge, recharge and refill our cups, our creative cups, and so as to be our very best selves, bring our very best selves, rather, to each and every interaction with our team so that we, in turn, can fulfill all responsibility to bringing out the collective energy of our teams and ultimately, which is ultimately, of course, the key to innovation and growth. Today, we're going to visit one specific tool in the leadership utility belt, and that is storytelling. Storytelling is one of our oldest creative crafts in and of itself, and perhaps our oldest tradition as a species. From our earliest days as a race, it now spans all forms of medium, and something we're introduced to at a very, very early age. And even as adults, experience in our downtime and in our professional lives. So from the campfire to the boardroom, it's always with us and in some way, shape, or form. And as we read in so many places, it carries with it the potential to move hearts and minds, of course, in a way that facts and data alone simply cannot. And yet, so few approach story in an intentional way and treat it as a tool. Which it is. Even so, storytelling is a tool of leadership that is also a very popular topic, and one I know many of our viewers here and all of us here in the room, our virtual room, have read many pieces on. And so I want to try to move from the general to the specifics and start our conversation off here in a place that is maybe much more practical. So let's begin by connecting this concept of storytelling as a practical tool back to one of the challenges we discussed last week that we all face, being how to quiet the noise, the chaos, the distractions all around us, and actually be present in our interactions when we are leading and when we are in a position of followership, and encourage others to do the same and draw them in. So Laura, your research and doctoral work in applied psychology, you've studied what motivates us at a basic level, and mindfulness being kind of one of your areas we've talked about quite a bit. Can you start us out by answering this question of kind of what is it about sharing context through story that really encourages us to actually be present in a conversation when we're dealing with all these distractions yesterday? I mean, you and I were like chatting about this a little bit yesterday, and we were both getting distracted left and right and having to pause. What is it about story that helps us calm the noise?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. So storytelling is one of my absolute favorite topics. It's something that transcends generations, right? It's something that no matter what phase of life you're in, what culture, what age, you can always connect through storytelling. And one of my favorite psychological outcomes of storytelling is that it forces you to be present. So what does presence mean? Presence means that you are aware of where you are right then. So you are aware of your surroundings, you are aware of smells, sights, sounds, it's a total sensory experience. And when you're listening to a story and you're engaged in that story, you are fully captivated, you are present, you're not checking your calendar, you're not thinking about your to-do list. You can start to empathize with the characters, right? You can relate the story to something you've experienced. It's how we learn, it's how we teach social norms, cultural norms. It's how we start to create something that in psychology we call meaning making. It can also be called schemas. It's how we categorize the world. It's how we develop our sense of identity. And so when you're listening to a great story, you are identifying with the characters, right? Maybe you're identifying with the world. Maybe your worldview has been exploded and you're now faced with this new way of thinking or doing or being or believing. And so it forces you to be present, which is something that we that we struggle with so much in today's society, right? Especially with technology. I mean, we are plugged in 24/7. And when you're listening to a story, though, or you're watching a story, you are engaged and you are there. You are present and you are in that moment. And that is powerful.
Laura, a big part of that I love that you address is, that presence is incredibly important, not just in that moment, but for the future, right? If you're 100% present, if you're, all your sensories are absorbing, you're absorbing and you're memorizing, right? Like you can go back and in a snap of your finger, you can go back exactly, 1 week ago, I know where I was, I know where I was sitting on the couch. Everything is alive and present and real. And I think to try and, switch that back to leadership, is that, you know, if you are communicating like that and you are forcing, not forcing, but motivating, hopefully, those individuals to be present, to be there, they are gonna, you know, that's gonna stick with them, and they're gonna continue that and continue that, you know, that passion, that vision, that sensory perception, and just keep it with them for, you know, who knows how long.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
From a leadership perspective, it's something that both of you said. One is about that storytelling is being used. We talk a lot, we hear a lot about storytelling and selling storytelling and leading, and I'm often surprised at how few leaders actually, or aspiring leaders, actually tell stories and hone that craft. And Laura, you're talking about being present. I think one of the reasons that we don't do that, yes, there are distractions in the world, but there are distractions in their view, in their traditions 200 years ago, whatever the distractions were. Being present and lack of storytelling is often about laziness. If you're a leader, you know, I want you to change this one thing. So you think I'm going to tell you to do it and you're going to do it. Storytelling and building those moments, that takes time. That takes presence, which is what you're describing. That takes intentionality, and it takes practice. Because we've all told stories that, or tried to tell stories that have fallen flat. It's embarrassing. We don't try it again. You've heard me quote, and I've quoted Maya Angelou thousands of times, and that is, she always says that people will forget just about everything that you ever say. They will not forget how you make them feel. And so that's at the heart of storytelling. But Dan, I cut you off. Tell me.
No, Brian, you were going exactly where I was hoping you would. In fact, I might take that a step further. I'd be curious, like, Brian, you're a really good storyteller. I think some of us have had some individual interactions, at least I've heard, like how you've employed story with people individually, but even on stage, I mean, as a performer, this is something that I know that you spent a lot of time thinking about. And I'm just curious, and this, Brian, for you and for the rest of our group here, when do we feel that maybe a story is most powerful? When it lands with someone, what is it about, what stories are the most powerful, and what are some things that make them resonate with people at maybe a more individual level that kind of helps them put things in context and then able to move forward in a way that maybe just simply explaining a process just won't do for them?
It is. So I'll take it a little license with that, in that
Please.
There's always the opportunity to tell a story. It's not necessarily a moment. In all forms of communication, it could be large, it could be small. There's always a convenient time, and it's always best once storytelling becomes a part of your DNA. It's like building any other muscle. Once you do that, almost all of your interactions with people will be some form of storytelling. And I'll give you an example. I had a boss once. His name was Buzz Waterhouse. Talented guy. He was the head of strategy for Lou Gerstner at IBM, and I was a newer president, and I always thought, hey, your record is the only thing that matters. About a year into the job, we're doing really well. And I had been a senior sales and marketing officer for 14 years. Buzz was failing in helping to communicate to me that at the present level, it's a different language, it's a different constituency, but I had this, hey, your record's everything. So one day, he just gave me a book, and it said, what got you here won't get you there. So my point with telling you that is, when I coach people half of my time now, and when I talk about humility, I often coach senior sales officers who often had a mindset of the likes of which I had. So telling that quick Buzz Waterhouse story for 35 seconds is more likely to reach them. Then I give them the book and I personalize it, but I'm more likely to reach that instead of saying, hey, XYZ, you need to be more humble. You need to think about a different language. But I was able to do a bunch of different things in a very short period of time. So my point is, it doesn't have to be a long story. Most of the time, the story is a 20 or 25-second story, but you're far better off reaching people through some form of anecdote or a story. That will be what they're more likely to remember.
Brian, I like that. In fact, I might double click on one of the things that even you did there with us just now. It wasn't even someone else's story. It was your story. There were names associated with it. It was personal. And I might purport that story is perhaps the most powerful when it is personal. Maybe it gives you credibility because it's somewhere you've been. And especially if that's a very impactful story, someone knows that maybe you've been in a similar situation, you've navigated through something like that, and you can at least empathize with them.
And can I share one thing? So I have a background in theater. People would say to me, well, you're more extroverted. You have this. That's all bunk. Where I learned this power of stories, especially in interviewing in business, I was a 21-year-old. I was interviewing for a resident assistant job at Western Illinois University. I had never really interviewed for a job before, really, and a job that I really wanted because it's room and board plus a stipend every month. And I still remember her name. Her name was April Lemon, and she taught me the most valuable early lesson in interviewing in my life. She set me up, and she said, "Brian, do you like to tell stories?" And I said, "Sure, April." She goes, "Tell me one now." So I learned a couple things. Told a story. I got the job, but I remember her saying to myself, "Well done, April." I was 21. What did I know? You're not going to let me off the hook. So it's not just the storytelling, but then I remembered in the early interviews, which I'm getting a little bit off topic here, but that is don't let people off the hook. But she was also, that's your question about context, it's a residence community. She needed people who were comfortable building community through stories, through adventures. And if you can do that, you were more likely to get the job. But
one thing that Brian brought up last week was, I believe it was last week, was that sometimes you might do some, something self-deprecating or whatever to really lessen, the mood, make people feel comfortable, put their guard down. You talked about storytelling, Dan, and you talked about Brian told it from his own perspective, right? Not somebody else's story, but his own story. And that's just, you shouldn't just be telling, things where you've always succeeded and high fives and ho-hos for everyone, right? There's not much that can come out of that, right? You say you learn more from losing than you do from winning. And so you can both humble yourself in these stories by coming up with past mistakes or whatever it is. And as Laura said, brings people present and in the moment. And if they can learn from your mistake and they're present, they can hear it and they get all those sensory perspective and they understand, they're not going to make that mistake. They know exactly how Brian felt. He communicated it beautifully, right? And so a big part of this as leaders is to be able to, communicate our successes, but most importantly, our failures to our subordinates and to those that, are looking for us, for that leadership, for that motivation. And so by providing those stories, I think that can, it really opens up, people's minds to different ways of going about.
I think what you're saying is so powerful, because what do all leaders, if they're any good, what do they talk about at the core of leadership? They talk about trust. So when you're telling a story, especially if it's along the lines of what you're describing, it makes you more human as a leader. You're building trust. That then leads to openness, creativity, innovation, all those wonderful things. But telling a story is like telling a joke or whatever the case is. You have to get good at it. You have to be willing to practice it, and you have to be willing to fail and fail a lot. But as we progress in the conversation, I have some tips for people as they learn to tell stories, how to cheat in a story, and which are helpful, right? You have a little cheat, but when you guys are open to that, let me know.
Brian, I think we should maybe just go ahead and go there right now. I think you can put out that hook and then not come back to it. I think we can come back broad, but let's go real deep there for a moment, because, and I'll give a practical example outside of a business setting too. Last night, my daughter said, "Hey, Daddy, will you tell me a story tonight?" And I just felt woefully inadequate, Brian. I was just I'm not sure where to start. I love stories myself, but on the spot, you just where are you going to pull this from? So I think
what's your daughter's name? What's your daughter's name, Daniel?
We have two, Geneva and Evangeline.
Geneva, what story would you like to hear tonight? What would you find the most interesting? You're doing a couple things. You're getting into storytelling mode. You're buying yourself time, and the story that she's most interested in hearing is the story that's most likely to have your greatest bang for your buck. Cheat. That's a quick cheat. It's like we've all given toast before, right? So around my house, when we have dinners, I've got 4 kids, 12 to soon to be 21, and they always love it when I do this, quote, quote, because they don't, but I anyway. And I force them to give toast about each other. Harrison, how was your week? Great. So when you think about Kate right now, if you were going to give a toast to Kate, you love Kate, don't you? Oh, I love Kate. She's amazing. If you're going to give a toast to Kate, what would you give today? What would that be? Crickets. Then the cheat might be, well, you saw Kate out doing her video vlog by the goat pen, and you might say, first word that comes to mind is creativity. It's like a toast. So one of the things I love about Kate is you tell a quick anecdote, 15 seconds, and then here's the cheat. If it goes on too long, you start with the word creative, right? Because that's your punchline. What I love about Kate is she's really creative. For example, I'm watching her out there, then you tell your story about about being outside by our goat pen. And then if you feel like you're losing the audience, then you just take your glass. I always have Tabasco in hand because my son is a Tabasco in hand. But here's what I have. You take your glass and you finish it real fast and you say, here's to creativity. Boom. So my point is, it's like writing a good paper. What's your intro, what's your body, what's your conclusion? And you always know that you can get to the conclusion real fast if you need to, if you're losing the audience. So that would be a form of a cheat. But as long as you hit your headline word up front, in this case, Kate's creative. You're losing the audience because maybe you're going on about the goats and things like that. Boom, you're finished to, here's to creativity. Everyone loves. We feel good. Here's to creativity.
Right. I'm wishing that when I'd given a best man speech not long ago, I'd had a chance to talk to you first. I think it would have been a lot easier to put that thing together. That's good.
Brian brought up
you guys have seen the movie Wedding Crashers, haven't you?
Of course.
Yes. Where he is giving, whoever the actor is, famous guy, is giving advice to the woman who's about to give their
Owen Wilson.
Right? What's right? Give the speech, and it's going to be disparaging. She thinks she's being too clever and funny. He goes, just do it from the heart, man. Do it from the heart. Just make it fast and do it from the heart. And then she got there on her own, but that's the tip. 30 seconds from the heart. Cheat. What's your headline word up front? How do you cheat quickly to the end? That's a quick cheat. But you did before you did your toast.
Very good. Brian, I'd love to, do you have any, and this goes to Tom, Laura, other thoughts and kind of like how you have in the past, maybe even outside of social settings too, are there some ways where we can kind of practically, maybe even cheat, Brian, to your point, in putting together, like if we have some very complex information to convey in a more professional setting, and it's mostly just kind of facts and figures, where are we going? We've got a lot of data to work with, right? What are some ways, practically speaking, that we can turn something into more of a story, and the story, again, that the data tells us, but maybe even put our client or ourselves or our company or our colleagues sort of in the role of the protagonist, introduce a villain, that we have to overcome. What are some things that we can do to make, what might otherwise be rather, on the face of it, sort of dry material, but turn it into something that's more compelling, gives the context, and spurs people to action? Any thoughts on that?
I've all kinds of thoughts on that, but I'll start with Laura or Tom.
I think one thing that's so compelling about storytelling that Brian touched on is that you need to engage the audience, right? And you need to make it something that's relatable. So I actually started in biochemistry way back long ago.
There's something new about Laura today.
Yeah, and I remember one of my favorite professors, we'd be trying to memorize these huge molecular equations, right? And it's just so hard to wrap your mind around it. And you're trying to model a 3D molecule in your head while imagining all the chains that connect these molecules. And one of the ways he got us to remember them was through storytelling. So there was this one particular, it was actually for the Krebs cycle, which is biochemistry. It's the way that our cells essentially turn energy into water. And so it works all over our metabolism, but it's incredibly complicated. And so he told this whole story where he came up with words that sounded like the chemical equations or the chemical compounds, which is 3 letters, right? So it's like UAA, UGA, that kind of thing. And it was about this elk, and you're driving, and your car is a lemon, and you hit the elk, and so you slam on the brakes. And he made all these sounds to sound like what the 3-letter chemical compounds would sound like. And I remembered that so well. And so I think that that's one of the things that makes a great leader and that connects leadership and storytelling is that you can break down incredibly complex concepts. You can tell heart-wrenching stories or powerful stories or incite motivation in people. And you do it by breaking it down in a way that is relatable and understandable to an audience. Because not everyone is going to have your level of understanding of data or executive search or leadership or any of these like more challenging constructs to understand. But if you break it down and you do it through storytelling, you can engage an audience and you can make anyone, no matter what their level of understanding is, engaged. And remember that, right? And as Brian pointed out, people won't remember what you do or what you say, but they'll remember how it made you feel. Stories create emotion and evoke emotion. And when you can do that in someone, you can get them behind your why, right? Which all the thought leaders are like, business is about your why. If you can get that, you have people who are motivated and who are also working for your why. So use storytelling to explain challenging concepts to just level the playing field, right? And it makes you approachable and it makes you engaging and fun.
Yeah, Dan, some topics are just inherently boring, right? They're just inherently boring. If you want to talk about, finance or how numbers are hitting the bottom line, like how do you tell a story about that? Maybe you can't tell a story about that specific thing, but you can, as a leader, you can, I would hope you're creating a vision, a purpose, why are we doing this? If we do X and Y, Z is going to be the outcome. And, this is why these numbers are so important. And it invokes that emotion. It invokes that passion in the leaders in the workers, that they're not just, Excel people just, chugging along. There's actually a meaning and purpose behind what they're doing. And if you can kind of create that, even in the most mundane tasks, you're winning, right? You're doing what you should be doing as a leader.
Yeah. Amen.
And it doesn't have to be, it depends on how we define a story, or it can be an anecdote. And so the topic is every leader at every level has to communicate data and numbers. Everyone does. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes it's a safety net for a leader because they're often making the mistake. If their boss is in an audience, they think the boss wants all kinds of data. So it's a retreat to safety to just talk about the numbers and the goals and things like that. And I'll give you an example. So as a former head of sales, or a president or CEO running a company, as you know, I've been in education. The vast majority of my career has been spent in education. So like any other leader, I have had to get in front of large audience and small audiences, communicating goals and data and outcomes that we're looking for. So I'll give you an example of a story cheat. It's not interesting for a president or a CEO or a head of sales to just put up numbers up and rah, and here's some video stuff to get to the goals. We want to do $1 billion this year. It's much more interesting to say, in my audience in particular, which are often people who are in education, who's our customer? And then I just shut up. And then I'll look at someone in the audience. Who do we work with? You pull it out of them. This is like storytelling. And then they'll say, we work with teachers. And then you say, because again, I'm about to present numbers. And they'll say, do grades matter to teachers? This is a form of storytelling. Do grades matter? They'll almost always say, well, yeah. Do they really? Or what do they really say? And I borrowed this from someone else. I said, what's the most important thing in leadership and business in the end? Any great master teacher will tell you throughout time that grades don't matter. They're the lagging indicator. The only thing that matters is engagement. So that's how I present numbers in that regard, because I know that throughout the course of a year, I'm going to be looking for engagement. I'm going to be looking for activity. I'm going to be looking for other things. And if I just hammer on numbers and data, that's
not going to work.
But now I've set up my entire year by thinking through that. But that takes work. You just don't come up with a spot. You'd have to think. You have to try it. But a story doesn't mean you have to tell a long story. It can be an anecdote.
Yeah, something brief. Brian, I'm gonna double click on something for all of us here for a second, because I love getting super practical with some of these cheats. and other things. This is as much of a comment as something I'd love for all of us to comment on. But we often hear about like getting comfortable with silence, getting comfortable with building to a moment, Brian, as you've talked about, and getting comfortable dropping the mic sometimes, and that can be as powerful as a really emphatic sort of statement where you're filling the air too. And Brian, you just did that a couple of times in your short story there, right there. Can you comment on how you've gotten comfortable doing that, and how you know when you're building to a moment, and how you know when you need to just shut up as opposed to plow through?
Well, I've said before at our different conversations that most of the ideas that I have are not my own, but it's okay to own other people's ideas as long as you're the kind of person who gives credit as a factory setting. So I've also mentioned before that I've hired thousands of salespeople directly and indirectly. And I've also listened to people who are far better sales trainers than me, both what I call boxed trainers, your Zig Ziglars of the world, spin selling, and other sales people who are just gifted at also teaching their craft. So any really strong sales trainer will start with this, and they'll say you have to get comfortable with silence. And it's hard to do. I'm doing it right now. Because people are often thinking about what's next. How do I respond to something? And how do I sound smart? But it's okay to say nothing. And then you're being more thoughtful. And then it gives you mindfulness, as Laura would talk about. But in order to, silence takes practice too, especially in front of a large audience, because oftentimes public speaking is something that few love, but when you get great at it, you do fall in love with it. But silence is the most powerful weapon, among the most powerful weapons you can have in a sales call, and among the most powerful weapons you can have in a presentation. And it's okay, because always remember this: the audience wants you to crush it. They're rooting for you, not against you. So if you go into it knowing that, you're golden, whether it's a small audience or whether it's a large one. So the idea of getting comfortable with silence is something, my advice is something you have to practice.
Yeah, Brian, I'm right there with you. I mean, this is something that I still struggle with, is that power of, not filling the air with noise. It takes confidence, right? It takes confidence in yourself and how you're communicating. But when you do utilize it, it is incredibly impactful in a conversation or in a story. Some of the best orators of all time, they pause. It's just they let it sink in. When you are an audience and you're digesting words at a mile a minute, right? You're taking all this input. To just pause for a little bit gives the audience time to stop on that last word or that last comment, digest it, let it sink in a little bit, and then it becomes a little bit more impactful with that. So that if you learn how to embrace it, and I'm getting there. I'm by no means am I an expert, but it is an incredible force multiplier when it comes to communication, if you're able to, tap into that power of the silence.
Somewhat ironically too, Tom, it's like, back to Laura's points from the beginning, it actually has the effect of forcing you to be present, as opposed to hitting people over the head. It's like, you get quiet for a second, people are drawn in. What just happened? I was used to some hot air filling the room here, something like that. So it'd be good. So I'd be curious, what thoughts do any of us have here on sort of this, the crafting these moments, getting comfortable with silence, making a point, dropping the mic? Does that matter any more or less in the current sort of online environment in which we're spending a lot more time in the last several weeks? Does it translate? Is there anything else we need to think about differently in a different virtual forum like this one when it comes to that?
I think in some cases it can be more powerful. I think we're all experimenting more with the medium. Even before this health crisis, we've all done Zoom meetings and Microsoft Teams or whatever your forum was, but we weren't doing it as regularly. So even in this forum here, it could be more, I'm practicing with the medium, because you can do more with the camera sometimes than what you can do even face to face. So I'm thinking, as I'm going through this topic of the day, which is storytelling, you see I'm moving closer to the camera, I'm doing different things, I'm using that medium to try to use it as a punchline. So I think in this this health crisis is teaching us how to use this format in a more artistic way. You can do things like bring in guest speakers. I'm coaching someone right now who's bringing in guest speakers all over his company that he wasn't able to do before. But now, because he's thinking about how do I make this more interesting? Well, before he would bring someone in a conference call. So I think that if you learn how to experiment with the media, I think it could be it's more powerful and certainly a more important part of all of our toolkit going forward.
I like it. I want to double click on something and maybe introduce something for all of us to maybe comment on for just a second. And then I want to take it in a tangential direction and touch back on something, Tom, that you were talking about at the beginning that is related, but it'll take us down a rabbit hole as well. So I heard recently something that was that I found pretty interesting. I hadn't really thought of as packaged in this way before, that you have sort of like process and philosophy when in any organization. You need to have kind of both, right? And you need to have a process for how you do some things. And we can get process can be overwrought. We can just be far too focused on that. And again, I can't recall where I read this, but it really landed with me well, and I would be curious as to thoughts here. The notion of philosophy over process and kind of comparing the two. If you have an overarching philosophy with which you want people to operate, you want your organization to operate, you think that's going to work really well and is aligned with your vision, that people can buy into and understand, is oftentimes more effective than process. Because if you move forward with process without a philosophy, you then have to have a process for virtually each and every interaction. You're just over-processed. But if people have an overarching philosophy, and maybe even some stories that demonstrate how you would prefer people act in certain situations, to take ownership of that you trust them, that they can move ahead with this mindset. And I don't care about the rest of it. And I don't give any sense at all about how you do it. But here is the outcome we're looking for. And here's how that's looked in these 3 different stories or scenarios, even if they're not immediately applicable in the details to you, that's oftentimes going to be a better outcome. And I think what the author was purporting, or what the commentator was purporting, was that indexing more toward a more philosophical approach versus process was probably the better way to go. So let me pause there. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would wholeheartedly say that, and this is in executive search terms, I would say that the philosophy is the must-have, the process is the nice-to-have. You have to start with the philosophy, right? Because that's your mission, that's your drive, that's your why. The process is how you can do it effectively and efficiently and sustainably, and you can scale. But if you don't have the philosophy, if you don't have the story, the process isn't even going to matter. Think about if you have 2 people that go in and pitch to the same venture capitalists. They both have good business models. One of them's business model is maybe incredibly dialed, but guess what? One of them has an outstanding founder story. And that founder story is baked into the business model, but it also explains to the VCs, hey, this is why I'm the person. This is why I am breaking the market. This is why I have the best business model, because this is my story and this is the impetus for this business and why you need to give me the funding. That person, 10 times out of 10 gets the money, guaranteed, because you have to have a why. Because guess what? If you don't have the philosophy, you are not a leader. A leader inspires.
If you don't have the philosophy, people talk about values. Philosophy and values, they're part and parcel the same. They're your North Star, period. So process, now there are a lot of people who can do process in the world, and process is very, very important, how you execute and get things done. There are fewer. Now you have to have a philosophy to be a leader. You have to have a point of view, but you have to have, I don't care if you're the CEO of a large company, the CEO's job is to build a philosophy here, and then every team lead has to be consistent with those values, but at the same time, your individual team, whether you're running a combat platoon or not, has to have their own values, your values as a leader, providing that they're consistent with the philosophy of the 4-star general or the CEO, whatever the case is. But without a philosophy and without values, it doesn't matter. Now, going back to storytelling, if your core philosophy is trust and integrity, has to be. If your core value is also, in my case, in addition to all that, joy and fun, so you'll have 6 or 7 or 10 core values, and then as you progress through your months and years of leading your team, you can hang interesting stories that help to even more directly frame your philosophy back to how stories really matter.
Yeah, it's good reminders. And Laura, that's a good reminder as well that you're backing not just the horse but the rider sometimes too. So, before we move on, Tom, to Brian's point, you've led men in combat. You've led a platoon of 50 folks in exercises in the field, and what I imagine, not having the exposure myself, is an environment in which you rely heavily on process. Kind of, this is how we do things. This is our approach. This is the chain of command. This is how things work. But undoubtedly, you've got to get people kind of bought in. Sort of like, these are various different situations in which this is how you react. This is how we be proactive around things. Are there ways in which you've seen what Brian's just talked through a little bit there employed, or you've employed directly in those situations that really seem to work, where story was important?
Yeah, great question. So as you can imagine, the military is laden with SOPs, right? Standard operating procedure. It's got procedure like written all over it. But one of the things that I tried to strive as a leader and instilling it in my soldiers was the importance of being flexible, right? You know how you know how to operate a weapon. You know what's the safe thing to do. When I'm not gonna get into details on go down the rabbit hole, but you know exactly how to react. You know those tactical decisions. But when it comes to big overall, like where we're going on the mission, we know the end result. We can't get bogged down into when this happens in the mission, then once that happens, then we have to do this. And when that happens, because you know what, as soon as, the outside forces, will say, have a say. And as soon as outside forces have a say, that process goes to the wind, right? It's to the wind. And then it's important for that team to still understand that end goal, but how do we get there with this process, maybe having these tangential, streets that we can go down. And so for me, the measure of a good leader and a good team is by far and away flexibility. You need to be flexible. You can't be stuck in doing something one way or the other. And I think, how do you kind of relate that to storytelling is that when you go about, describing what is ahead of you, right? What is ahead of you and your team? You can't go, oh, okay, by the way, there's this bunker over there, and so we should probably assault it. Yeah, Brian, you go first. Laura, just follow up right behind him and maybe attack from the side, right? It's like, all right, well, where's the passion? Where's the so what, right? How do you motivate people to do stuff that they don't want to do? And so you really have to employ, this is, we're going to have this person go over here. And the reason why we're doing over from this angle is because of X, Y, and Z. I don't want to get into the specifics, of combat, but you really decide, hey, the purpose of why you're going up there, what advantages that give you over an enemy or whatever it is. And you're telling that story of how you would go about the mission. And when people hear that story and, they get the overall purpose and the so what and what is the intent behind the mission, that's when, the magic happens. For when things don't, go exactly to how it was originally planned, they know that end goal still. Yeah. And soldiers are incredibly resilient. People are incredibly resilient and smart and really innovative, and they'll know how to get to that end result. You just have to give them the opportunity really to seize that.
Tom, I think what I'm taking away from that is just a really good example and reminder of the fact that process only takes you so far, and then philosophy has to take you the rest of the way. And in order to really ingrain a philosophy in people, story is necessary. They have to sort of see different applications of kind of where that philosophy is played out and kind of gotten you to the end in order to be able to then take it, make it their own, and apply it to themselves going forward.
Sure. I mean, one of my favorite leaders of all time would be George Washington, right? Could you imagine him, in like the thick of the Revolutionary War going, hey guys, I have a few muskets in the back of that, the back of the horses over there. And, we're fighting the biggest empire in the world. Like, we might win, you know, we could have a good chance. Oh, by the way, we don't have shoes. I'm not gonna be able to pay you, you know, next month, probably not the month after that. But, you know, if we end up winning, like we will be a new country. So isn't that cool? Like, no.
And if we don't, and me and everyone else, you know, we'll be hanging from that tree over there. But don't worry about it. It's all good, you know. People are going to take my land from me and everything else. Yeah.
Yeah, so Brian gets it. And so people that, you know, some of the best leaders of all time, like George Washington had to be an incredible order, incredible way to inspire, you know, passion, and for these, you know, militia to go against the biggest empire in the world. How do you inspire? Now, I'm not calling everyone to be the next George Washington by any stretch of the imagination, but if you can learn from, you know, his passion and creating that vision of why we're doing something, and this is the end result, and this is the you know, the values behind what we stand for and why we're doing this. I mean, that's the end game.
Absolutely. Well, think about one of, I would say, arguably one of the most famous speeches in American history. How did it start? I have a dream. Everyone, like, talk about mic drop. You're like, well, what is it? Does it impact my life? Like, how is this going to change everything? Maybe my dream's the same as yours.
Yeah.
Like,
It's interesting you just brought that up. I just written down ideas. Unless as a leader, you have to sell an idea, and you sell ideas through storytelling. I don't want to gloss over this thing that building and telling stories is a lot of work, and it takes practice, and you have to consider your audience before, and every audience is different and unique. But unless you're willing to say, I'm going to put the work in to tell a story. Do you guys know who Chris Rock is?
Oh, yeah.
Chris Rock is a famous comedian, and he's one of my favorite comedians. And he was on 60 Minutes maybe 10 years ago. And he had been doing for a long time a 90-minute or so yearly special on HBO. So he's being interviewed by whoever it was on 60 Minutes. And the person said, Chris, how do you do it? How do you do 90 minutes straight of pure gold? And Chris would say, are you kidding me? I spent the last 18 months on the road, going to every backwater comedy club, trying out new material, stories, because he's a storyteller. Half of it would embarrass me, basically, he would say. Half of it fell flat. And you know what it's like to get into an audience. And I would just continue to grow and build the stories, because that's what he does for a living. The stories that sold, I kept, and everything else was trashed. So likewise, you have to be willing to tell stories. You have to be willing to practice. And when you have a story that hit, you just put it in your repertoire. Before I came here, I said, okay, if I can find a way to work in MENA, April Lemons, Buzzwater House, teachers, if I can find a way to work it in, I will, but I won't force it in. So it's not that someone's glib and comes up with stories. You have to say, what's my audience? How am I going to try to do something here and have 2 or 3 things in the can? You may be able to use them in the can, or you might, or you may have to just try something entirely new on the spot. But it takes work, and it takes practice.
It takes a confidence and comfort in failing, too, to your point, Brian. So speaking of, I want to circle back, Tom, to something you talked about at the beginning around failure. I mean, we talked about the, story is probably most powerful when it's personal, and stories are probably maybe the most, if I took away what you're saying there, well, they're probably the most powerful when there's a failure involved, when it's not a win. It's raw. It's some time in which you made a mistake. Why is that? And what is it about sharing stories about our failures that makes us so accessible to others? And I'm sure that any one of us could think of a time when a leader in our own lives shared with us a raw moment. Maybe they let their guard down. Maybe we saw emotion behind their eyes and in their face, or they told us a very personal, raw story. What is it about that then engenders trust and just makes us want to follow them, despite the fact they're telling us about a time that they just fell flat on their face, or maybe went through a really difficult time? What is it about that?
For me, I think the grass is always greener, right? So bear with me here. The grass is always greener on the other side. And so if I'm just a worker and I look at, my boss and I see, okay, he's getting paid more, he or she, has this, and I have to do, the minutia stuff, but she gets the, whatever it is, right? The grass is always greener, and you don't really know potentially the struggles that, they had to face to get there, or that they are currently facing in their job, right? That grass is always greener. But when you hear those stories of, their firsthand account of them, failing and falling down and learning how to get back up, and then it clicks, like, okay, all right, that's why they're in the position that they're in. It's not because, they were, some people maybe are handed things to them on a silver spoon, but I mean, for most people, we work to get to where we're at, and by really humbling yourself, it makes you accessible and makes people realize, okay, they put their pants on one leg at a time, just like I do. I can come to them with problems that I have, right? Because they've lived them. I'm sure they could give me some type of advice or what to, it just makes everyone a little bit, it makes us human, really, is what it does.
Gives you a couch to go to and a comfort going to it. It's good. Laura, Brian, any other thoughts there?
Oh, this is one of my favorite topics ever, failure. And it's largely because I'm so afraid of it. And it took me over 30 years to start to be more okay with it. But I think, I'll just piggyback on the last thing Tom said, and it humanizes you. Mm-hmm. And as a society, we do not celebrate quits. We do not celebrate failures. And yet everyone has failed. And I think there's probably not a person on this panel that would say, oh, I learned more from when I win. No, you learn more from when you fail, because you realize what worked and what didn't work, and you can course correct. And so when you hear of a leader or someone that grass is always greener, that you think just has it together, and you hear of a story where they struggled, or they experienced adversity or challenges, or they just flat up failed and made a mistake, it humanizes that person. It makes them relatable. It makes them approachable. And it also helps you to cultivate your own confidence in your ability. And it makes you feel like, oh, I can fail. I can fail because he failed, and look where he is now, and look what he learned. So it makes you less afraid of failing. And guess what? When you're less afraid of failing, you start to live large. You start to get out of your comfort zone, take that risk, and actually start to chase the life that you want. And maybe that's leading.
It's interesting, Laura. You've it maybe somewhat ironically too. So Dee Dee, who's with us, had commented on just sort of the importance of charisma, in being a leader, and the added bonus of that, and of course in storytelling, your willingness to be raw and talk about your mistakes, even in a very maybe subdued fashion, sometimes I think maybe lends itself to having a certain level and certain type of flavor of charisma with people also.
One last piece of this from me, Dan, before we close. Yeah. We did a live stream the other day on the growth mindset. Carol Dweck's book, I'm sure you might have read. And there's the idea of the growth versus the fixed mindset. And oftentimes those who have the growth mindset, and it's often those who are perhaps don't have the most elite brain or whatever the case is, but they're willing to fail more. And those with a fixed mindset often are more elite or more achievement oriented. But if you can get to that place, you ultimately build trust, and you build growth, and you communicate your failures, and you build trust often through stories, as Tom and Laura pointed out. But if you haven't read that book, you should, people who may be watching at home, you might get it. Carol Dweck's Growth Mindset.
So a goal I think we should have for all these sessions, Brian, which I love that you just tapped one of them. We should always come away with a book that we should read or a film that we should watch. And I think this time it was Wedding Crashers, which I wouldn't have expected for these sessions.
Cool Runnings last week.
There you go.
Which is a very good reminder, Tom. It's what an outstanding film. Wedding Crashers too, Brian, of course. But guys, thank you. I appreciate this. I think even just kind of appropriately, next time when we get back together, we'll talk a little bit about leadership as theater, which is something Brian has a lot of experience in, which I think is appropriate, not just theater itself, but like building to moments and getting comfortable again, kind of dropping that mic a little bit as well, and kind of some things we can take away from that industry and that art form to take into every interaction that we can potentially have in the boardroom as well. But guys, thank you again for joining us today. Thanks again for everyone who's joined us online. Just as a reminder that Into Growth will have content every day throughout the week at 11 a.m. Eastern. So we'll be back again next Friday in the director's chair, and so we'd love to have you back with us then. I hope you've enjoyed today's conversation, and if you found some value, please subscribe and hit that like button, and we'll look forward to seeing you again next week. And until then, and in the meantime, have a blessed and exciting weekend, and tell a story or two to someone.
Have a great weekend. Stay safe, guys.
Yes.
Cheers.
Bye, everyone.